Great. Well, welcome everyone to the French American Foundation Cybersecurity webinar on geopolitics and cybersecurity in Ukraine and beyond. My name is Carol Lapointe. I'm the program director of the French American Foundation Cybersecurity Program, and I'm also the co-director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Assured Autonomy. We are thrilled today to have Mr. Dmitri Alperovitch with us. He is the co-founder and chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, which is a nonprofit focused on advancing American prosperity and global leadership in the 21st century and beyond. He has served as a special advisor to the Department of Defense, and he currently serves on the Department of Homeland Security Advisory Council and on CISA's Cyber Safety Review Board. He's a globally recognized expert in cybersecurity and geopolitics, so we're thrilled to have him with us today. Thanks so much, Dmitri.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd really like to just start the conversation by giving you a chance to really orient us on what the lessons we have learned from Ukraine are.
Well, we've had actually a lot of cyber activity taking place in this war, perhaps less than some expected. And I personally have been surprised by the relative lack of retaliation in cyberspace by Russia against the West. Frankly, I did expect that in response to the sanctions and export control measures that the United States and its allies across Europe and Japan and others that have instituted against Russia, that in response to the weapons supplies that have been very significant, of course, for Ukrainian warfighting efforts in response to the intelligence that we're providing to Ukraine, that there would be a response from Russia. And so far there hasn't. Doesn't mean that there won't be, but that's, I think, a significant success for the administration and the broader allies in being able to deter Russia from launching a retaliatory strike, either in cyberspace or perhaps through other covert measures. But in terms of the war itself, we have had a number of incidents that have been actually quite significant. Probably the most significant cyber attack we've ever had in history in the context of warfare took place on February 24th of 2022 in the early hours of the invasion, when the Russian military intelligence, the GRU, was able to break into the networks of an American satellite company called Viasat that has been providing satellite communication services to Ukraine and the Ukrainian military in particular, and essentially release an update to the communications modems that were tied to one of their satellites that's covering Eastern Europe, and brick those modems, essentially wiping out the hard drives that are present in those modems. Not a supremely sophisticated attack, but incredibly effective in terms of impacting Ukrainian communications. Now, obviously, Ukrainians weren't just relying on satellite communications. They had radio links, landlines, and the like, but many of those have been targeted simultaneously as well by the Russian military, either through kinetic means or jamming and other electronic warfare capabilities. So the end result was actually a pretty significant degradation of Ukrainian communications systems in those early days of the war, which is incredibly significant. And when you think about the history of warfare, I'm not sure that there's been another case like this one where one side in a conflict has been able to effectively dramatically degrade the communications of the other party in the conflict. And it's hard to say right now, but it probably has had an impact on the initial Russian gains in the war. You may recall that in those first days of the conflict, they were able to gain quite a bit of territory. They took lots of territory in the south, all of Zaporizhia Oblast, a big chunk of Kherson Oblast. They got to the outskirts of Kiev. Afterwards, things have gotten obviously very badly for the Russians, but the lack of communications, we know, has had an effect on the Ukrainian ability to mobilize the defenses in those first crucial days. There have been other interesting attacks that the Russians have done. One of the more interesting, even if simplistic ones, has been their attempts to spread disinformation on social media in order to overwhelm Ukrainian government with fake information. So the Ukrainian government has been incredibly effective in mobilizing their population in providing tips and intelligence on what the Russians are up to, locating their forces, texting the Ukrainian armed forces and their intelligence services and local law enforcement as soon as they see something that they think might be relevant. And the Russians have attempted to degrade that communication channel and really vital intelligence collection capability by posting messages on social media pretending to come from Ukrainian government, telling people that if they see something suspicious, for example, if they see strange markings on their buildings, they should report it to Ukrainian authorities and providing phone numbers and communication channels in which they can do that. Completely legitimate communication channels, but as you can imagine, if you provide that broad guidance to people, everyone is going to see something suspicious on their building, and everyone's going to start looking. So that has resulted in an overwhelming number of kind of fake information coming in and flooding Ukrainian authorities and making them less effective in being able to process what is real and what is not. So those are the types of things that the Russians have done that have worked relatively well for them. And then in many other instances, they've just tried to literally stick Jello to the wall, try a variety of attacks that have attempted to shut down networks, have attempted to destroy those networks, and those largely have not been very effective. Obviously, they've occupied Ukrainians and have tied down their resources in defending those networks and rebuilding them. But the Ukrainians have gotten really, really good at that. And that's probably one of the consequences of the fact that this campaign, this war against Ukraine that the Russians have been waging, not just since 2022, but really since 2014, and a significant part of it playing out in cyberspace, has really prepared Ukrainian defenders in responding to attacks, particularly disruptive attacks. And they've gotten really, really good, perhaps the best in the world, at rebuilding networks quickly after damage is done and mitigating the impact. And that's been very, very successful for them. But overall, I would say, the critical mistake that the Russians keep making, and it extends beyond just cyber, is their inability to do coordinated combined arms operations. We see that playing out in the physical world, of course, where their infantry is not well connected to their artillery, is not well connected to their air campaign, to their electronic warfare capabilities. And the same is true in cyber. Cyber alone does not achieve a whole lot unless you tie it within the broader construct of your combined arms objectives. And the Russians, with a few exceptions, really have not been able to achieve that. And when you look at the implications of that for future conflict, it does not mean that cyber is irrelevant to warfare. I think quite the opposite. I think it's an incredible tool for intelligence collection, first and foremost, and both sides have used it very effectively to gain operational intelligence on what the other force may be up to. But there's also opportunities, I think, in conflict, future conflicts, for cyber to play a bigger role in deception, in disruption, and particularly when you start thinking about the potential of a terrible conflict in Asia, potentially between the United States and China. You have two militaries that are very advanced, that have a lot of weapons platforms that are highly networked. When you think about a system like the F-35, for example, our fifth generation jet fighter, it is essentially a piece of software with wings on it. And it is highly tied into logistical systems that are on the ground, that are connected in many cases to the internet. And through cyber operations, you can impact the readiness of those fleets, impact potentially the maintenance operations, and degrade the capability to operate a wing of F-35s, for example. So those are the types of things that you might see in warfare in the future, and how cyber can play a role in it. And you're not seeing that play out in great deal in Ukraine, because largely speaking, both countries are using quite old hardware, and the longer the conflict goes on, so especially on the Russian side, you see more and more ancient platforms, weapons platforms being brought out. So recently, the Russians are bringing in T-55 tanks literally developed in the 50s that not only are not connected to the internet, but have no chips in them even from those old days. That, of course, limits the opportunity for either the Ukrainians or the Russians to do a lot in cyber to affect the force itself. So let me stop there. I've spoken for quite a bit of time, and we can get into the discussion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great overview. And one of the things that often comes up is the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, right? And how that can be part of coordinated attacks. And we haven't seen that quite as much, but you talk about the level of automation. So can you talk a little bit about the level of automation and connectedness of existing infrastructure in Ukraine and how that may have affected what we've seen on the cyber front?
So there's actually been quite a few attacks on critical infrastructure. We've seen wiper attacks, disruptive attacks against the energy grid. And there are some reports that the Russians have been temporarily able to shut down certain substations in certain parts of Ukraine. There have been attacks in the financial sector, on the media and the telecom sectors. And some of those have been successful. But again, one of the things that we have to be appreciative of is that the Ukrainians have gotten really, really good at resiliency, at operating in the context of networks being down, networks being destroyed, and building them back up quickly. And they're doing this not just in cyber arena, of course, but in the physical world, where their energy grid is under continuous attack since October from Russian missiles, Russian kamikaze drones. And despite all of that, despite substations being set on fire through those strikes, the Ukrainian energy grid is holding. They're able to MacGyver, various capabilities together and continue to provide energy to the people. And they're doing very similar things in cyber. So it's not that the Russians aren't able to achieve certain effects, but they're not certainly able to sustain them. And because they're not coordinating them in a strategic way with the overall military campaign, it's really ends up being all for naught for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned drones, and so that's another thing that we've seen on the battlefield in at scale in a way that we haven't seen necessarily in other conflicts. Can you talk about some of the use of unmanned and uncrewed technologies that's happened?
Yeah, so certainly we have seen drones being used in warfare since at least the 90s, and obviously in the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, they've been a very powerful capability to provide intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance to our troops, being able to do strike missions against Al Qaeda and ISIS personnel. So that is not new in this conflict in Ukraine. Both sides have used autonomous vehicles to do artillery correction, which is a novel application of the drones. So one of the things that the Ukrainians have done really well is leverage the Starlink system, which is provided by Elon Musk. And Elon came in after the Viasat cyber attack and has provided lots of satellite dishes to Ukrainians. They also purchased some, and some countries like the UK have purchased Starlink systems for them as well. And they've been able to tie the drones to Starlink and to provide real-time video information to artillery systems like HIMARS systems and M777 howitzers that are well behind the front lines outside of the range of Russian artillery. And they're able to do real-time video and see what they're striking and dramatically lower the rate of fire that they have to expand to actually hit a target. So that's been really successful. And then one of the things that the Ukrainians have done really well as well is use very cheap drones that they're buying on Alibaba, Chinese drones that cost $10,000, $15,000, tie up explosives to them and fly them into certain Russian installations. They've done several attempts to do this in Russia itself and have had hits against, in one case, an oil refinery. In another case, they tried to hit but missed a gas compressor station near Moscow. So they were able to fly a drone hundreds of kilometers from Ukraine to almost the outskirts of Moscow and to try to execute an operation to destroy an energy facility there. So that's been very innovative. And we've also seen, of course, both sides use consumer drones, DJI Mavic drones in particular, where they're just attaching a camera to them, and in some cases even grenades and dropping them on individuals or on tanks to try to destroy very cheaply these expensive weapons platforms. That part is not unique. We have seen ISIS in particular pioneer that technique in the Battle of Mosul and a few years ago, and in Syria, but it's being used quite effectively in Ukraine.
Yeah, thank you for that. You spoke as well about disinformation, right? And how effective kind of disinformation campaigns have been. And one of the things that's playing out on the technology background along this is really the explosion of generative AI. So as we look to future conflicts, or even what's going on in the Ukrainian conflict, I'd love for you to talk about what you see as the potential impact of generative AI. Are we going to see much more disinformation? Is that going to help bring it in at scale, as some have said?
So I think the way to think about the generative AI is that it is absolutely going to change our lives in many ways that we can't even contemplate today. It's not going to change everything, and it's not necessarily going to replace, I don't think, a lot of people. It may replace certain categories of jobs, but in most cases, I saw a great quote from someone in the last couple of months that AI won't replace people, but it will replace people with people that use AI. And I think that's the way to think about these capabilities, is that they're a force multiplier in many ways and can help you do certain tasks much more efficiently in a variety of different areas, but you're still in many cases need a human to actually drive them, to guide them, to ask questions, or to provide tasks that it can actually perform. And in the disinformation land, you still need to come up with great ideas for how to execute campaigns. And AI can help you with generating text and pushing it out. But the ideas still, in many cases, need to come from humans, in my view, at least for the foreseeable future. And you've seen Russians succeed in some areas, but fail pretty badly in other areas with some really crude disinformation campaigns. So, for example, in early days of the war, they were pushing out narratives on Ukrainian social media that Ukraine was about to get invaded from Poland. And of course, no one in Ukraine was buying it because they could see with their own two eyes who was invading them, and it wasn't the Poles. So those are the types of things that the Russians have just done really, really poorly, and no amount of AI is going to help you there.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we're starting to get a few questions in the Q&A. So I invite audience members to put questions in. So we have one from General Jean-Paul Palmeros about, can you elaborate on the role and limits of private companies in supporting Ukrainian cyber resilience?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things that the Ukrainians have done that have worked really well for them. One has been the move to the cloud, and in the run-up to the war, they moved virtually all their government networks to Microsoft, Google, and Amazon clouds in an unprecedentedly rapid way, right? I mean, I don't think you've seen a migration on the scale done literally in the course of weeks, and it's worked really, really well. So, by the way, this is a lesson for many companies out there that thinks it may take them many years to do a migration, that when push comes to shove, turns out you can do a lot of things very quickly. And that has done a couple of things for them. One, it has limited the impact of kinetic strikes because a number of telecommunications infrastructure data centers have been targeted by Russian missiles. And now that the data is no longer present there, it has enabled them to keep providing critical digital services to the Ukrainian populace in spite of those strikes. And on the cyber front, it has allowed them to take advantage of the enormous capabilities that these platform companies have on the cyber front. And there are probably no greater capabilities in the world in cybersecurity than the ones that are at Google, Microsoft, and Amazon, because of the number of people and the number of resources they're throwing at this problem. And they undoubtedly have benefited tremendously from that. The other thing that they've done is there have been companies that have provided them with free hardware tokens called YubiKeys that enable you to have much more secure authentication systems where you're not just putting in your username and password when you're logging in, but it also requires a physical token to be plugged into your machine to authenticate you to a particular service. And they've rolled this out pretty widely, almost comprehensively, within a couple of months to all Ukrainian government employees. And that has limited Russian ability to conduct successful spear phishing campaigns where they can steal your passwords, get you to put in your passwords, because now the password is no longer sufficient to get in. There's still ways around it, even with hardware keys, but it dramatically limits the scope of attacks that can be successful. So those are some of the things that I think the Ukrainians have done really, really well. I see a number of companies are continuing to provide them with intelligence on what they're seeing in terms of Russian malware that is being detected around the world, and that is also helpful.
Great, thanks, Dmitri. And we had a question from another audience member. What is your opinion about the IT army that Ukraine has built in order to support this fight?
I don't have a really high opinion of it. So they've tried to use these sets of volunteers in a couple of ways. One, from an offensive perspective, they launched some pretty rudimentary attacks against Russian networks, trying to do denial of service attacks against various sites in Russia. Really has been more of a nuisance than anything else for the Russians. So I don't think it's been very effective, and really actually introduces some complicated questions for the West in terms of how to respond to this, because one of the norms that the United States, for example, and many other countries have been trying to establish is that other countries should not use vigilantes to conduct cyber offensive operations. And here we have Ukraine obviously doing that. That creates some uncomfortable conversations for Western officials. But aside from that, it's also been quite ineffective. On the defensive side as well, they've tried to mobilize resources to help rebuild. That's been a little bit more successful than the offensive stuff. But in general, you can't just parachute into a network that you don't know anything about and orchestrate a successful defense or build resiliency to that network. That takes time and concerted effort. You can't just do this on a part-time basis. So those types of things are not particularly effective.
Great, thanks for that. I want to go back to a comment that you made about, really the lesson learned and how quickly you can migrate. When push comes to shove, you can migrate your data to the cloud, and then it's a lesson for companies. When we look closer to home, say in the United States, so much of our critical infrastructure is under the control of private companies. So I'd love for you to talk about some of the vulnerabilities that we have stateside, right, especially with kind of more highly automated infrastructure in some ways, and what the lessons learned could be in that front.
Well, I think the big lesson that we need to learn is resiliency. No one's going to be able to stop all attacks, particularly against determined adversaries, and the Ukrainians are not able to stop them either. So we should not be sort of overly confident of their defensive capabilities here. But what they, again, have done really, really well is focus on resiliency, focus on limiting impact, making sure that when there is impact, they can get things back up and running very, very quickly. And a lot of it has just been through experience, right? Having been hit by the Russians for many years now, predating this conflict, particularly in cyberspace, with several attacks on their energy grid that have actually shut down power for a number of hours to different parts of Ukraine, having witnessed attacks like NotPetya, the most disruptive cyber attack in history that spilled out from Ukraine and hit many other companies around the world, including American companies. Those are the types of things that have built a lot of know-how, a lot of instinctive knowledge of what to do. So people are not in shock when their network is completely decimated. They know what to do. They have the processes established to communicate with each other. They know exactly how to quickly rebuild things that are the most essential right away. And I think more companies need to be practicing that. If you were asked, average company, could you even communicate with each other if your Active Directory system, where all of your information is about people's emails, phone numbers, etc., is down, right? And when you're emailing someone on a corporate network, and you're trying to find their number or their email address, and you're putting their name in, it actually makes a query to this Active Directory server to get it. If that server is destroyed, could you even know how to contact anyone? Do you have backups of their numbers, their emails? In most cases, in my experience, the answer is no. People are just unprepared for those situations. They focus a lot on defense, and that's appropriate, but they also need to plan for failure, because no one's going to be perfect, and failures will occur. And there needs to be more of a practice for doing that type of resilience. And I'll tell you, some of the big tech companies are really, really good at this, and they focus not just on resiliency against cyber attacks, but natural disasters, earthquakes and the like, taking data centers down. One of the things that has always impressed me about Google is how they thought about this really thoughtfully, where they literally have these practice runs on a regular basis where they randomly shut down critical machines across their entire cloud network just to see what happens, what breaks, and making sure that things are much more resilient in the future. Many more companies need to be doing this.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And, so Jen Easterly and Ann Newberger were both actually French American Foundation Young Leaders in years past, and have spoken to this audience frequently and to other audiences about cyber hygiene and individual cyber hygiene, right? So, does that play a role as well when we're looking at critical infrastructure for kind of individual employees? And what would you say on that topic?
Yeah, it's really important, but it's also important to sort of look at it from a perspective of a threat model, right? So, what does cyber hygiene mean? It means it means doing the basics, right? It means having strong passwords, ideally using a password manager to generate random and unique passwords for every account that you have. In the physical world, it means locking your door when you leave your house. And that's very effective if someone is going around, perhaps a criminal group in your neighborhood, and just trying to jiggle the doorknobs to see if the door just opens up, and not really doing anything sophisticated to figure out how to disable the alarm system and how to, get through reinforced doors or anything like, right? It's not going to be effective if your threat model is SEAL Team 6 is trying to get through your door, right? That's not going to stop it. And you have to appreciate that hygiene is very effective at neutralizing sort of the common threats out there, where someone is not targeting you specifically, but maybe it's a criminal organization that's casting a wide net, and they're just hoping that someone is going to click on their email or give up their password so that they can do a ransom operation against you or steal your data or what have you. But they don't really care if it's you, your neighbor, your friends. Money doesn't smell, and they don't care where they get it from. It's a very different threat model where, you've got an intelligence service or military that actually wants to break into your company because of what your company does, right? If your company is providing electricity services to a suburb of Kiev, well, it doesn't really matter that, an electricity utility in Poland is more vulnerable than you are, because that's not the target. And the basics won't really help you as much. It does help that the adversary doesn't just walk in through the door that's wide open, that they have to do a little bit more work to get through. But you have to appreciate that you have to do way more than the basics to be resilient against those types of operations. So this is not an argument against hygiene, but we need to appreciate what the limits of that approach are.
Absolutely. And another threat, obviously, is kind of an insider threat. And we have a couple questions here about the recent leaks, the intelligent leaks that we've seen in the US and the documents that have come out. Do you have any comments about those leaks, the source and the impacts and potential effects of these recent leaks?
So obviously, we're talking about classified information here, so I'm not going to speak to any details about those documents. But anytime this happens, it's incredibly damaging to national security of both the United States and its allies. In this particular case, I can think of at least 3 ways in which this will be damaging, and in one case, I think could be very dire, namely for Ukraine, where there are reports that these documents contain detailed information about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, and even though it doesn't include location or timing, it provides great detail on the units that are involved, their manning, training, and equipment levels. That's going to be really, really helpful to the Russians if they're able to take advantage of that, and may literally result in loss of Ukrainian lives. So that is a very, very serious situation. and also is going to create a lot of distrust between Ukrainians and Americans. We already know that the Ukrainians are very hesitant to share information with us. Well, now they have a really good reason not to, right? Because we're unable to keep very sensitive information secret. And the same is going to be true of other allies that may be more hesitant to share intelligence with us, because this is not an isolated incident. We've had so many leaks in the past decade. We've had the WikiLeaks Chelsea Manning situation. We had Edward Snowden. We had the shadow brokers leaks of the NSA tools, which is still not we still don't know who did that one. We had the leaks of CIA tools by another CIA employee. So if you're an ally, an intelligence service somewhere that is thinking about sharing capabilities, information with the United States, you may be thinking really hard about whether to do that, because you won't have confidence that we can actually keep that information confidential. So that's incredibly damaging. There's also going to be impact to allied relationships. The South Koreans right now protesting against information that maybe we have had some collection on what they're doing in their political system. Same with Israel, etc. So those things, can be fixed, and a month from now, no one is likely to remember that anymore, and people are usually adults and appreciate that countries do spy on each other, even if they're friends. But nevertheless, these types of things are unhelpful. And then the longer term impact from this, I think, can be also very significant, because even though these documents don't appear to indicate the specifics of how that intelligence was collected, in many cases, you may have the Russians or others figure out, if we're talking about, if the intelligence talks about a telephone call between two people, well, now that telephone call was intercepted somehow. Maybe you're going to work harder on making sure it's not intercepted in the future. So is it going to shut off various collection ways for us to determine what the Russians are up to, or what other adversaries around the world are up to? That's a big question, and could create enormous damage for many years.
Yeah, absolutely. A tough situation. We have a couple other questions that have come in. One is asking about, once again, infrastructure. So is the cyber threat bigger for classic internet infrastructure or for the industrial infrastructure? And also, what is the role of the Starlinks given to the Ukraine? Did they somehow mitigate the risk for the Ukrainian online services?
Yeah. So in terms of what is the bigger threat, it depends on how you define bigger, right? If you think about impact, well, clearly attacks on industrial are way more dangerous, because you can literally result in loss of life. For example, there was an attempted Russian attack on a Saudi oil refinery back in 2017, I believe, or 2018. And they were trying to disable a safety system. And if they had succeeded in that, you could have had a fire and explosion at that facility that could have killed people, right? So you're not going to do that with any attack on an IT system and wiping out databases. So in terms of impact, there's no question that attacks on industrial systems are much more severe. In terms of the probability of an attack, well, right now you still have the vast majority of attacks being undertaken against IT systems. And usually to get to an industrial control system, you may have to go through first an IT network anyway, before you can jump to the industrial side. Not always, but in many cases. So, I guess the answer would be both are really important. And, if you look at an attack like Colonial Pipeline, which shut down deliveries of gas and other chemical products to the East Coast a couple of years ago, well, that was an IT system ransom operation that resulted in the shutdown of the pipeline voluntarily by the executives of the company, because they've lost confidence in their ability to operate the pipeline safely, and decided to unilaterally shut it down for the first time in their history. And then it took many days for them to get it back up and running, because they've never practiced restarting a pipeline and had to sort of start from first principles. So those are the types of things that you want to be cognizant of. Even an attack on IT network can sometimes, if you're not prepared, result in significant impact to physical systems.
Great. And, specifically the question then about the role of the Starlinks given to Ukraine, and did they somehow mitigate the risk for Ukrainian internet and online services?
Yeah, so Starlink has been absolutely essential to Ukrainian war effort. I would hate to see how this war would go for the Ukrainians if they didn't have Starlink. They're using it for communications across their units. Every brigade in Ukraine has Starlink terminals now. They're using it for artillery correction, as I mentioned, has been a huge saver for them of artillery shells, minimizing the expenditure rates, which are quite high already, and are an enormous problem for the Ukrainians. This has been, by the way, really important to understand, this entire conflict has essentially been a war of artillery on both sides. Most of the damage to both militaries has been caused through artillery. The consumptions of artillery shells are the highest we've seen in Europe since World War II. So both sides are incredibly short on shells, and anything that can minimize the rate of consumption of artillery shells is an incredible advantage. And Starlink is critical to that. It is critical for enabling them to collect intelligence on the Russian forces as well. But it comes with a downside, and that downside is that the person that controls the system is Elon Musk, who has expressed some ideas that the Ukrainians are not appreciative of about their sovereignty and what they should give up in terms of their territory to Russia. And in particular, he has instituted a so-called geofence on Starlink, where Starlink is not available beyond the front lines in the Russian parts of the territory. The signal does not beam there, and you might think that's a good thing. So the Russians can't use Starlink, but in reality, it's actually an enormous problem for the Ukrainians, because if they're trying to do covert operations deep behind enemy lines, they cannot communicate. If they have a successful breakthrough in this upcoming counteroffensive and get far behind the Russian lines, they'll be out of communication range, which will be an enormous problem for them. And then they'll have to contact Starlink and try to adjust the geofence. Can they do it quickly? There are big questions around that. So the Ukrainians are certainly not happy that this geofence is on. And so far, they've not been able to convince Elon to give them control of it. So on one hand, it's been an incredible savior to them, but it comes with downsides. And it's quite remarkable to think of this unique situation we have in history, where you have essentially one person that is not affiliated with any government that has a disproportional impact on how this war might go. And it's literally up to his whims.
Yeah, but that also begs the larger question of, we're at a time when so much of what we could consider critical infrastructure in the communication space and in the cloud is controlled by companies, right? So are there other lessons learned there about, what private industry controls that are becoming really vital to just the functioning of governments, whether it's military or governments writ large?
Yeah. I think this is a unique situation, right? If you look at other companies, Lockheed, there's no Mr. Lockheed that's going to say, you know what, I just woke up one day and decided not to provide capability to the US military. You just can't even contemplate that, right? These companies are solely relying on US government. They're beholden to their shareholders, so their shareholders will not look kindly if they decide to upset their largest customer, right? But with Elon, you've got one of the richest people in the world that can wake up one day and decide that I don't want to do this, and there's absolutely no one in the world that can stop him. And you don't have that situation with any other commercial provider. It's not even close. So that's really the difference here.
Yeah, we have seen in the past, like with Project Maven a few years ago, when Google decided not to, continue the options on their contract to continue on that. So do you think there are other vulnerabilities that we have because of our reliance on companies?
Yeah, and that was a small project. And by the way, Google is back in and doing a lot of things with the Department of Defense and the broader government. They've doubled down on this. So, for a minute there, they expressed concerns, but it really did not last. So I'm not seeing that as a broader concern across the nation. Obviously, if you have reliance on foreign companies that may decide to cut you off because of geopolitical reasons and maybe pressure from their government, that's a different story. But at least here in the United States, with U.S. companies, Elon is really in a category of his own.
So we have some other questions that have come in. So Doug Price is asking, in the prior presidential administration, some commercial cyber attacks by Russian groups linked to the government were tolerated, and counterattacks to degrade the capacity of these groups were discouraged by the administration. How has the Biden administration increased its active measures against these attacks, and what are they doing to harden commercial networks domestically?
Yeah, so I don't actually agree with that premise. I know a lot of great people that worked in the previous administration. Chris Krebs, famously the head of CISA, and John Nakasone, who's still the commander of Cyber Command and the National Security Agency, and Neuberger, who's now the Deputy National Security Advisor, but was running cybersecurity efforts at NSA. I don't think any of these people were tolerating cyber attacks or not focused on counterattacks. And in fact, there have been quite a few pretty groundbreaking counterattacks that have been launched against Russians and the Prigozhin Internet Research Agency and others in the past administration. So I don't think that the premise of that question is correct. But that policy has continued, and the Biden administration formalized that policy in its cybersecurity strategy that just came out a few weeks ago, that cyber responses to criminal activity and nation state activity are part of our overall framework, that we're not just going to sit back and rely on only defense and keep taking hits with no response, and that we're going to figure out the right way to use cyber to disrupt operations, to impact criminal groups. Cyber Command has done some really innovative work along with others in the intelligence community, for example, steal crypto wallets from criminal groups that are orchestrating ransom operations so that they would deny them the benefit of their gains and then distribute those gains actually back to the victims from whom they had stolen those ransoms. So those are the types of things that are happening right now in the government, and I think they're continuing from prior administrations and will only get more aggressive.
Great, thanks. I do want to pivot to kind of the beyond part of this conversation, right? And looking at Asia and some of the tensions that are rising in Asia. And as you're talking about crypto wallets, I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts about what's going on with, obviously, North Korea has been using cryptocurrencies for a long time to amplify its financial reserves. So, what do you see as the role of cryptocurrencies and what's going on there?
Look, one of the things we're seeing, obviously, in the collapse of this deflation of this crypto bubble is that there are actually very few legitimate purposes for crypto. That the two primary purposes that people are seeing is fraud and enablement of a variety of different criminal activities, both online and offline, like drug smuggling and terrorist financing and like. And then the other is speculation and Ponzi schemes. So outside of that, I've seen very few use cases of actually legitimate use of crypto. I'm sure there are a few, but the vast majority are illicit or speculative. And there's no question that it has been a huge boon to a variety of criminal actors. I mean, the entire concept of ransomware does not work without crypto, right? Ransomware did not just pop up in the last 10 years. The idea that you can break into a system and encrypt some files has been around for many decades. In fact, the first case of ransomware actually occurred in 1990, if you can believe it or not, over 30 years ago. But it didn't work and didn't spread because what happened is that the actor in that particular case, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken, someone from Pakistan actually broke in, encrypted the data, and then left a note saying, please wire this money to my bank account. Well, you can imagine that it didn't take long to track that person down. And there was a natural deterrent effect of how do you collect the payment anonymously in a way that you're not going to be tracked down. It did not work until the emergence of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies that fueled the explosion of ransomware. North Korea has been leveraging cryptocurrency theft to funnel money into their military programs, into their ballistic missile program, into their nuclear weapons development program. So there have been just enormous downsides to crypto that I think people are not appreciating. And at least from my perspective, this may be very controversial, but I've not seen many upsides.
So another question came in that I think will also be very relevant to kind of the pivot in the conversation to Asia. So how is the massive amount of data that is generated across all networks and domains collected and managed for future use, including AI training and future C2 or command and control improvement?
Yeah, so this is not new as well. This trend has been going on for 15 plus years, particularly in cybersecurity, where you've actually had lots of cybersecurity companies and the big platform companies in particular becoming essentially the biggest signal intelligence collection agencies in the world, where essentially every piece of security software these days is connected to the cloud and is collecting intelligence on what's happening inside that network from a cybersecurity threat perspective. Microsoft has the largest network of anyone because every Windows machine, every Office installation, every Office 365 user is essentially a data collection opportunity for them. And that has been incredibly helpful to those companies to get a global picture on cyber attacks and improve their capabilities to detect them. And has been, I think, game-changing for cybersecurity over the last 15 years. And all these companies have been using machine learning algorithms before people started calling it AI. It was called machine learning, and so none of that is actually a new trend at all. It will continue to accelerate.
Great, thanks for that. And I'd like to go back to kind of this idea of specifically the lessons we've learned in Ukraine and how they might inform some of the rising tensions in China, especially obviously over Taiwan and the eternal threat of what might happen there. So what do you think the impacts and lessons are?
So one, that the success of cyber operations in warfare is going to be highly, highly dependent on the ability of militaries to integrate them into their overall military planning. You can't just have cyber sitting off to the side in the silo and expect it to do anything significant and strategic. And one of the mistakes that I think even the United States has made in the past is treat it as a completely separate capability in a way that you would never do with other parts of our military weapons platforms. You'd never say to the artillery guys, go win the war for us, right? Without infantry support, without armor, without air support, etc. They're all integrated into the overall battle plan. And cyber has traditionally not been that way. And if you look at the one time where we used cyber in a significant way in a military campaign, it was a campaign against ISIS in Syria in 2015. And it's now widely documented that Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, the late Secretary of Defense now, at the time, went to Cyber Command and said, I need some cyber bombs. Well, with all due respect to Ash, who's great man and great Secretary of Defense, that was the wrong question to ask, because the question is not what cyber dust can I have that I can sprinkle on this battle plan and impact ISIS. The question should have been asked, what do we want to do against ISIS at a tactical level or at a strategic level, and how do the various capabilities that we have in the U.S. military, cyber and non-cyber, can play a role and amplify our effects? That is the right question to ask. But if you just ask a cyber person, what can you do? They're going to come up with a range of things that may have very little effects on the ultimate adversary. And, the question, I think the big question, the big unknown for potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific is how good will the United States be at that integration? How good will China be at that integration? China has not been in a conflict since 1979. The military is untested. There's literally no one in the Chinese military, active military duty personnel, who has ever seen conflict. And that's a big deal because, if you don't have that experience, it's going to impact you, at least in the initial phase of the war. So that's the big unknown. When it comes to critical infrastructure, the one danger, of course, of the conflict in the Indo-Pacific is that it is highly unlikely to stay in the Indo-Pacific. That in almost every circumstance that you can think of a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan, let's say, you're going to have impact to the mainland, to the Chinese mainland, and more importantly, to our mainland. And it's going to be cyber and potentially non-cyber. And we need to be ready for that.
Yeah, and I think that goes to a question that Art House has asked, right? Getting back to kind of our own critical vulnerabilities with critical infrastructure. So have we learned any lessons regarding the vulnerability of US critical infrastructure, especially utilities, from the war in Ukraine?
I mean, we're just as vulnerable as the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are running many of the same systems we are. Over the last 2 decades, they modernized their grid. They've implemented a lot of Western equipment, Western technologies, and running many of the same things that we are today. In fact, to the extent that we're more advanced, it's probably a downside because we've lost a lot of the manual controls that used to exist in the grid. I'll give you one example. When the Russians launched their first cyber attack against Ukrainian energy grid in 2015 over the winter holiday and shut down power to, I believe, 800,000 people for a number of hours during that winter season. One of the things that the Ukrainians were able to do very quickly is get into their trucks, drive to the substations, and manually hit the override switches and fix the power. We don't have that capability anymore in much of the part of the United States grid. Those manual overrides are gone. It's solely dependent on automation. And that's a problem where we are not thinking of failure scenarios. We're not planning for failure, either natural or human caused. And we are not designing our systems that way. I'll give you another example. In the industrial control systems back in the 90s and early 2000s, you had a little capability on what's known as PLCs, programmable logic controllers, essentially mini computers that you use in industrial control systems to translate bits and bytes to physical outputs, regulate this motor, spin it up, spin it down, increase voltage, whatever the effects you're trying to have in a particular industrial control system. And there used to be a little switch on those PLCs, not unlike, I'm dating myself here, but if anyone in the audience remembers the floppy disks, that they had this little read-write protect switch that you could flip, and essentially you would not be able to write anything to that floppy disk if that hardware switch was flipped. And the exact same capability existed on those PLCs. It was like, a 2-cent part or something, like really not material to the cost of the overall PLC. But in the interest of efficiency and automation, there's almost no PLCs that have it anymore. And the problem with that is, of course, what you could have done if you still had that part is you could program that PLC in the lab, test it, flip the switch and put it in production. And then no cyber attack effectively would be able to do a whole lot to it because you literally could not write anything to that PLC and modify its code. And we don't have that anymore because people thought that A, we can cut costs if we remove that piece. And 2, probably even more importantly, that wouldn't it be nice if we could just modify that code on the fly without dragging it back into the lab and just make changes in production. Amazing efficiency, right? Well, in the name of that efficiency, we did away with a critical safety control and cybersecurity control that could be pretty important. So we need to start thinking back to kind of first principles of how do we make our systems more resilient. I think we overwhelmingly focus on prevention. And look, prevention is important, but prevention is never going to be 100%. And we don't do enough planning for what happens when that fails. We rarely ask that question. And if we start thinking about it that way, we find out there's lots of really simple and fairly cheap solutions that you can implement that, yes, they may impact some productivity and some automation capabilities, but the wins in terms of assurance, in terms of safety, I think are going to be massive.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as we come to our last few minutes, so General Palmeros would like to ask, what would your recommendations to improve multinational cyber cooperation be, especially, obviously, this is the French-American Foundation, so, between US and the EU and France. And he would also like to know that you are very welcome to come to our cybersecurity conference in December.
Thank you so much, General, for that invitation. It's very kind of you. I've been a part of the terrific events of this foundation for many years now, going back to 2010s, and it's always a pleasure to be back. So look, I think there is still a great opportunity to expand on the incredible alliance that we have with France that goes back to the founding of our republic. And in cyber in particular, there's way more to do. In my dealings with the French intelligence services that operate in this domain, I've always been incredibly impressed by the talent and the enormous capabilities that they have. Obviously, there's a relationship with the U.S. intelligence services. It's not as close as the Five Eyes relationship, which is unique in history, but it is quite close. But I think more can be done to improve sharing of intelligence, conducting of joint operations, and partly that can be done in the allied space as well, as we're working jointly to help the Ukrainians, for example, as we're working to build more interoperability and assist allies within NATO that may not have as many capabilities to defend their networks as others. There's, I think, a great opportunity for French and American cooperation.
Great. And I'm going to ask you just one last question as we wrap up. Obviously, you think, eat, breathe cyber and cyber threats all the time. What keeps you up at night?
Well, I sleep pretty well at night. I don't sleep for a long time. I probably should expand my sleep schedule, but to the extent I do sleep, I sleep well. But what I worry about is actually not cyber. I worry deeply about the state of the world we have right now, particularly when it comes to the US-China relationship. I think we're entering an incredibly dangerous decade where I firmly believe we're in the new Cold War already. If you look at the definition of a Cold War, this fits it perfectly like a glove in terms of the state of relations between the United States and China. And in many ways, I think it's even more dangerous than the Cold War because except for a couple of instances during the first Cold War, namely the Cuban Missile Crisis and a couple others, you really had very limited probability of a conflict between the two superpowers. Probability of conflict between the US and China is extraordinarily high, first and foremost because of Taiwan. And, I was on the record publicly in early December of 2021 with a long thread on Twitter saying that I firmly believe that Vladimir Putin was going to invade Ukraine before the winter was over. And the reason I predicted that so confidently is I looked at this authoritarian leader in Russia that believed that it was his mission in life to build a greater empire, restore the lands that he thought were historically his. He thought that the West was weak and would not respond. He thought that he could easily execute this mission because the enemy was also weak and would not fight and could be bought and fall for his disinformation campaigns. He thought his military was strong and highly capable of that. And we'll look at all those reasons. They map exactly one-to-one to the Indo-Pacific and to President Xi in China. And also, by the way, President Putin had no one around him who would tell him the truth, who would tell him, no, this is actually going to be really complicated and we can't pull it off. The same now exists in China, particularly after the last Party Congress, where he basically put all of his own people on the Politburo, all yes men. So we're entering an incredibly dangerous decade because if he moves against Taiwan, win or lose, it's going to be a disaster for not just the United States, but really the world. And the one area in which I disagree with President Macron is that when he's saying that we don't want to choose between the United States and China, I don't think that France or anyone else in Europe are going to have that choice. But the United States is at war with China, and that war will not be contained to the Indo-Pacific. We're part of the NATO alliance. We're part of the Western democracy alliance. I don't think France or anyone else will be able to stay on the sidelines. And the cost in lives, destruction of infrastructure, global depression is going to be the greatest we've seen since World War II. And that is incredibly dangerous. And I think everyone should be thinking every single day in this country and around the world of how do we avoid that scenario? How do we make sure that China is deterred against invasion of Taiwan? That cataclysmic event will be a million times worse than this terrible, terrible war in Ukraine.
Well, we appreciate your comments. It's truly a somber situation, and we appreciate the fact that you are serving in so many advisory roles for our U.S. government, and we definitely appreciate you taking the time today to come and share your insights.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. And for everyone who joined us, thank you. And if anybody's interested in learning more about our cybersecurity program through the French American Foundation, please visit our website and get in touch if you'd like to participate. So thanks so much, Dmitri, and have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.